Okay, everybody, so this is really part 2 of the chapter 12 social psychology lecture. We're going to now talk about conformity, as well as a couple other really interesting things when it comes to social psychology. So conformity is when you adjust your behavior, adjust your opinions, or judgments based on other people. So you're matching other people, or you're matching the norms of a particular group or situation. And social influence is how we study how our behavior is influenced by other people, how our behavior is influenced by our social environment. So the question is, what will we do? How far will we go in order to match behavior and to change behavior? And it turns out that we go pretty far as a people. So this is an example of Ash's line experiment. So here you can see that there's a standard line to the left, and to the right you have 3 comparison lines, A, B, and C. And if you look at it, there's a pretty obvious choice. The standard line matches B. A is too short, very, very short, and C is shorter. B is the obvious choice. And so this is an example of one of the sets that Ash did in his particular study. So I'm going to explain the study itself. And there's a video that's available on Moodle as well. So in this particular line judgment experiment, what it was the experiment was rigged. And so there was one person who was the experiment was basically based on. Everyone else was considered a Confederate, and a Confederate is a person who's in on it. So this is a person, a Confederate is a person who knows the experiment and they're told to say or do a certain thing. And so essentially what they did is they would have a group of, 5 or 6 people, and they would all be sitting around in a table, and then they would see these lines pop up. And so they were told, okay, which is the correct match, A, B, or C, for the standard line. And so the Confederates were told that 12 out of the 18 times to pick a wrong line. So they would pick either A or C. And the person who the actual experiment was on was usually rigged in terms of where they were sitting. They usually were last. And so imagine being in a room and they said, okay, well, I want you to match the standard line with the correct line. And the person beside you says, oh, it's definitely A. And the person beside them says, yeah, A. And the person beside them says A. And you're thinking, but it's B. And so what will you say? Okay. So it turns out that 76 participants actually conformed and said it was not B. And at least one time they went ahead and conformed. So remember that they're giving the answer, so many times correctly, but then 76% of those people at one point conformed. The subjects agreed with everyone else and gave the wrong answer on 37% of the critical trials. So 2/3 of the time they're like, it's B. It's B. But then, 1/3 of the time they're conforming. And you ask yourself, why is it that people knew this was an obvious choice? They knew it was incorrect, but yet they still went with it. Turns out that there are 2 types of social influence of why people tend to conform, why people will agree with something even if they know it's wrong or think it's wrong. Normative social influence is when you don't want to be disliked. So if there is a group of people and everyone's saying it's A, right? And the answer is B, but every time you say B, they roll their eyes and they go, oh, this one again, or, oh, I can't believe this person is, doing this. You think, well, I don't want to, that makes you anxious and uncomfortable. And so you don't want to be that person who is disliked. And so a reason why you might conform is just so that other people like you. You conform, somebody might say, what's your favorite movie, or what's your favorite musician? And somebody says, ooh, I love Taylor Swift. And maybe you hate Taylor Swift, but you're like, oh yeah, I love Taylor Swift. And you might not actually like that, musician, but you say it because you want to be liked. So that's a type of social influence. Another one is informational social influence. So maybe they're not sure they heard the directions right. Maybe they're not sure. Maybe they're like looking at the line and thinking, well, maybe they're seeing something I'm not. And so they'll say, well, I'll just conform because I think that that might be the right answer, and maybe I'm just seeing it incorrectly. So, that's different from wanting to be liked and knowing what you're doing is wrong. What we find is that there's actually some things in place that can make a situation happen where you're more likely to conform. So if you have 4 or 5 people who are saying the same thing and they're against you, you're going to be more likely to conform. If you have to say something in front of people, then you're going to be more likely to conform. When they repeated the ash line experiment, but instead of having people say their answer out loud, but they wrote it on a sheet of paper and nobody heard it or saw it or read it, people very rarely conformed. When they thought that nobody was going to hear their answer, they rarely ever conformed to that. If they hadn't expressed a commitment already to the idea, they're more likely to conform. Think of it like you're in a group with some friends and somebody says, what do you want to go eat? And you really want to go to Taco Bell. Like that's where you really want to go. But somebody says, hey, let's go to Burger King or McDonald's. And then you never like started out saying, I want to go to Taco Bell. And then everyone's like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And then they look at you and you're like, all right, fine. Yeah, we'll go. If you had in the very beginning said, I want to go to Taco Bell, and then everyone else goes, then you're going to be a lot less likely to conform because you've already expressed your commitment to something that's different. If it's something hard, something ambiguous or difficult, if you're not sure if you're doing it right, then that is going to be more likely for you to conform. Think of it like you're in a class and you have a group project and you don't understand the instructions at all, the directions. You're going to look at somebody else that seems like they know what they're doing, and you're going to let them take the lead and conform to whatever they say, simply because you're not sure yourself. Also, if you're part of a group that you really, really like and you really want to be friends, then you're going to be more likely to conform and do what they want to do because you want them to accept you. So the idea of conformity, following along the crowd. A lot of people say, oh, there's no way I would follow along. There's no way I would do this. But there's been so many experiments done where people will just blindly follow the crowd. They conform to the crowd. There have been experiments done where they will have people in a room and they'll pump smoke under the door. And if everyone else acts like it's okay and there's no crisis or emergency, then the person being experimented on will tend to not get up and not ask for help and not, go and find an exit because they think, well, everyone else is acting like it's okay, so it must be okay. So we find that there are a lot of examples where people will follow the crowd when normally you would think you wouldn't do that. One experiment that I like to do in class, this is really fun to do to kind of see how far they'll take the conformity thing. It's just a real simple one where I'll ask half the class to sort of stand up. And this is at the beginning of the class. So anybody who comes in after a certain point, they don't know what's going on. And so everyone's standing and no one knows why. And I tell everybody, don't say anything. If anybody asks you why you're standing, just don't talk to them. And so what ends up happening is a lot of the class will stand. And then I'll ask them in the end, I said, why did you come in and stand up? You never stand up in class. You always come in and sit down. And they'll go, well, I just felt uncomfortable. I didn't want to be the only person not standing. I didn't know if I missed an instruction. I didn't know if I missed something. And I just went with it because everybody else was doing it. And it's a really funny sort of thing to watch, but it happens. Sometimes it can be a good thing. And a lot of times though, it tends to be a bad thing. Another sort of related thing to conformity, so conformity sort of going with the crowd, is obedience. And obedience is following instruction, right? So doing what you're told. So I'll tell the class, okay, everybody stand up. And then everybody stands up. And I'm like, well, why did you stand up? And they're like, well, you told us to. And then, I'm like, okay, let's sit down or do a jumping jack or something. And the question is why do people obey and who do people obey? So obviously obedience is all about authority. So if somebody of authority tells you to do something, then you're inclined to do it. if somebody has a higher status than you, it gives a command, a supervisor gives you a command, you're going to do it because you don't want to get in trouble. You don't want to rock the boat, or because the fact that we're taught from infancy to obey authority, a higher authority figure, and that would be, for example, your parents or grandparents, or a policeman, or a teacher, or somebody that's a preacher, or somebody that has higher status than you. And so when the idea of obedience came around, and looking at different studies to measure obedience and all that, Stanley Milgram was a proponent in this type of research, and so he did a very, very famous obedience experiment to see, can people be pressured into committing an act that they find immoral, something that violates their own conscience and actually hurts somebody. And we're going to talk about where this idea of conformity, obedience, and social psychological research came from at the end. But it's important to remember that these ideas come from, the ideas for experiments and ideas for studying this come from real life instances, right? So society and what is happening historically. And I'll talk about that at the end. But when it comes to Milgram, he wanted to know, can I ask a person to hurt somebody and they think they're hurting them? And how far will they go? Will they potentially kill them? And so this was a question of, can we do this? And so this, let's see, I don't think I have it in here. Yeah. So originally when the experiment it hadn't been conducted yet, but they were talking about doing it. They had students, they had experts, they had psychologists, they had doctors, and they asked them, they said, what percentage of people do you think would actually commit an immoral act and would obey what they perceive as an authority figure? And everyone said, oh, very little, 1%. Nobody's going to engage in this kind of immoral behavior. And it turns out that they were very, very wrong. So this obedience experiment, Milgram's obedience experiment, essentially there's a video that goes along with this and it explains it really well. But essentially what it is that a person is at a desk, okay, in front of a grid that tells us that there are electric shocks. So, and it tells you the voltage of those electric shocks. That person who we're interested in, that's the person we're experimenting on, is called the teacher. And so the teacher is listening to a speaker, and on the other end of the speaker is what we call the learner. Now, the learner is a Confederate. They're in on it. Everyone's in on it except for the teacher. The teacher's job is to say a series of words, and the learner has to repeat those words. So essentially learn the words. When the learner gets the word wrong, the teacher shocks them, okay? So the key point here is that the teacher can't see the learner at all, okay? And they don't know this, but it's actually a recording. They're not actually interacting with somebody. They think they are, but it's just a recording. So every time they shock somebody, they hear something like, ow, or oh man. And as they go up in the shocks, okay, they get progressively more agitated. The learner does. So the teacher hears them, and at the point of where the shocks become dangerous, there's actually marks on the electric grid that says dangerous, could cause death, could cause harm, or XXX, right? The person starts getting more agitated. The recording is, oh, I have a heart condition. Oh, I can't. Oh, that hurts. And the learner sounds like at one point that they have become unconscious. The teacher's job is to continually administer shocks whenever the learner doesn't engage or says the wrong thing or doesn't, or is not doing what they're supposed to. So the teacher is thinking that they are giving this person shocks, okay, and they're supposed to continue on with the experiment. And so it turns out that quite a few, and I don't have it, let's see, okay. I don't have the percentage here. I thought I had it on here. I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head. thought I had it on this slide. I apologize for that. Okay, hold on. As I continue talking, I will get the percentage to let you guys know. So the when the experiment was going on, they were really surprised about how many people actually administered enough shocks that it would be harming the person, as well as making them go unconscious, and at one point potentially killing them. And so if you watch the video, which is very interesting video, by the way, you can actually see how much distress this causes a person. And so you ask yourself, is this ethical to be able to do this? Because it actually is harming the person. It's harming the person in the sense that they are feeling like they're actually hurting someone, and that does in fact cause psychological harm. And so we want to make sure that whenever we do any sort of experimental work, that we do not cause harm to that person, whether it's psychological harm, physical harm, whatever it may be. So you might ask yourself, would you ever be able to do this experiment ever again? And it turns out that they very recently, scientists actually, for decades, it was said, we can't do this experiment ever again. There's no way. And it turns out that this was, one of those things where we said, okay, part of an ethics debate, we could never redo this experiment, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that very recently, in the past 5 years, it's been redone. But the idea is that it was less shocks, quote unquote shocks, and it didn't go to 450 volts. And remember, nobody's getting shocked. Nobody's getting shocked in this, but the idea is that, that they wouldn't go up to that point anyway. I think it stopped at 300. And they redid the experiment. It turns out that people still did it. So, okay, here are the statistics. 2/3 of the subjects, so 26 of the 40, were fully compliant and went to the full 450 volts. And of those who did not go, of those who defied the experimenter, meaning that they said, I'm done, I stopped, no one stopped before the 300 volt level. So everyone got to that point before they thought, okay, I do not want to continue on. And it turns out that when it was replicated, the same results happened again, and it was the same thing. And they've tried this with different types of people. They've tried this with men, with women, with different age groups, and it is consistent across the board. When the teacher was told to continue on, they continued the experiment. Now, one thing that we know that was done in the original experiment that was unethical was that the person felt like they didn't have a choice. In research today, we know that we have to really make sure that our research participants know that they can stop at any point, and that they do not have to continue with the study, and that there's nothing that's going to happen bad against them, no negative things if they quit. And this experiment, they actually didn't know that. Even though everything was scripted, everything was repeated. This was considered unethical, mostly because they felt like they didn't have a choice. So when an experimenter was in the room, they acted as the authority figure. When they figured out that there were some, and this at the time the experiment was done several different ways in a lot of different sort of iterations, and changing little things here and there. It turns out that some things we found really do influence obedience. This sort of well-established mental framework to obey. For example, in the military, from the day you go into the military, you understand chain of command and understand that there's, you need to obey your higher authority figure. So there's already this well-established mental framework. And then also, if you consider the fact that, our culture establishes this mental framework because we're told at a very early age to obey our authority figure. The situation or context is important. Who's around you? Are you in a familiar location versus not? Are you in a laboratory versus outside? those things influence obedience. Really, who's present is very important. Is the person seen as an authority figure? If you have a very young person who seems unsure of themselves, then they will not be considered an authority figure, and they won't, and the the participant won't actually engage in obedience. We also found in psychology that gradual repetitive escalation of the task. So it went up to 450 volts, but it only increased, I believe, 20 or 50 volts as they went. So you think to yourself, well, I'm giving them 300 volts. What's 315 volts now? What's 350 volts now? And so, it starts very, very low and works its way up. Then we have a hard time deciding, when are we going to stop? What point are we going to draw the line? And also the experimenter giving assurances. One thing you might notice in the video, very important, is that one of the participants says, are you going to take the blame? Are you going to take responsibility? Well, if a person feels like they can absolve themselves of responsibility, then they're going to be more likely to obey, because it makes their conscience at rest. So when the experimenter is able to reassure them and say, you must continue, you must go on, that made it more likely the person was going to obey. Now, like I said, there's been lots of different sort of iterations of this experiment, and you can see the variations on this table. It's really interesting. And I actually have it on here that 65% of the original study went to 450 volts. So I didn't have to get those stats, but there it is. Anyway, so when the teachers were the authority themselves and were able to choose the shock level and not have somebody behind them telling them, you must continue, you must increase, 95% of them didn't even go past 150 volts. So, that wasn't obedience. They were obeying themselves and said, I don't want to do this. This is unethical. I don't like this. When there was somebody else in the room that said, I'm not comfortable with this, when somebody had somebody else to kind of go off of, they were like, okay, I don't want to do it. So when somebody else mustered up the, courage to say, I don't want to do this, then they were able to defy authority. When the experimenter seemed like they did not think it was ethical or didn't want to continue on, then the person did not continue. If they feel any sort of pushback there, and you can see the different variations on this table, very interesting, of when, they were able to obey versus when they didn't obey. So where does this come from? Where does the work come from, and how do we use this? What are the implications of this work? Well, obviously, Ash and Milgram were thinking about the real world and the actual real social factors. And if you look at instances of like the Holocaust, if you look at how people do things like they'll go to war, and they will, shoot other people and kill other people, whether it's people with guns or children or women or whatever it may be. All of this information that we get from obedience and conformity can be applied in real world situations. You see, for example, during the Holocaust, many people say, well, I was just obeying orders, because if I didn't obey orders, then it would be me in the concentration camp. It would be me being, killed with a rifle. I would be shot. My family would be killed, So you have to think about how this relates to society and how this relates to things that happen in the real world. And we know that, of course, everyone has the capacity to resist group or authority pressure, but there's always more information and more factors at hand than just simply obeying, not obeying. You have to think about the kind of pressure that people get from other people, in the fear that can be instilled. And so we know that there are factors that can distort judgments, distort perceptions, and encourage things that will actually violate their conscience and violate what they consider as ethical behavior. For example, propaganda is something that's used to distort how a person views the situation, and so they could, be fed lies. And we see that happen all the time. For example, during World War II, there's a lot of propaganda against Jewish individuals, and so they were turned in neighbors, family members turned in people because they were afraid that they were, causing problems for society. And it led to, millions of people dying. So this can be certainly applied to the real world, unfortunately. And we also have examples, of course, of like prisons and how is it, and there's a really famous Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, and there's a movie based off of it as well, where a set of college students was actually, they were set up to mimic a prison, and they had people who were guards and people who were prisoners. You find that when you give people authority, sometimes they abuse that authority. And if a person is a prisoner, sometimes they act like a prisoner, and and there can be a lot of problems with that. But of course, it's very important to study that and to understand how people behave and what the situations, those situations created, how we manage that kind of behavior. And we find a lot of times that the heinous crimes committed against people are usually because a person is dehumanizing that other person. And when you dehumanize somebody, meaning that you kind of see them as lower beneath you, you see them as not as important, you see them as bad or harmful, then you treat them, you can treat them as such and make it easier on yourself to engage in violent, aggressive, or prejudicial behaviors. So that can be very problematic. And we see that a lot of times in war, where a group will be dehumanized in order for the other group to come in and kill them off, or genocide or something like that. So it's definitely in our society and in the world, even today. So when we talk about aggression, we talk about why is it that some people act aggressively. There's theories about frustration, and how frustration is the feeling that you get when you feel like you're being blocked from attaining a goal. The more frustration you have, the more aggressive you can behave. We know that a lot of people have the misconception that men are more aggressive than women. And if you look at children, especially like young boys, tend to be really aggressive. And some people say, well, they're more aggressive than girls. Turns out that there is actually no gender difference in aggression, in terms of how much it's expressed. It's the type of aggression that's expressed. So boys and men tend to be more physically aggressive, a lot of rough and tumble play, whereas girls and women tend to have more relational aggression, which is backstabbing, starting rumors, less physical fights, and more of sort of, the sneaky, quiet stuff, which is still considered aggression. So men and women aggress equally. They just engage in different types of aggression. So if you take social psychology, you learn a lot about why people act aggressively and violently, and also why people act altruistically. And so I want you to think of pro-social behavior as like a big umbrella, right? So this is a term. Pro-social behavior is any sort of behavior that's helpful to another, whether it's driven by, not good intentions or not. It doesn't matter. Pro-social behavior is simply any behavior that helps another person, another animal, whatever. Okay, so that's pro-social behavior. It's what we refer to as an umbrella term. It's a big term. Underneath pro-social behavior, there is a section called altruism, and that's a term that falls under pro-social behavior, but it is a specific kind of pro-social behavior where you have no expectation of reward, no expectation of benefit. You just do it because it's the right thing to do. And so there are some scientists that argue there's no such thing as altruism, because even feeling good about the act is a motivation and a benefit. And we like to say, you're just being pessimistic. The idea behind an altruistic act is that you're not doing it for attention. You're not doing it for praise. You're doing it because you want to, because it's the right thing to do. So an altruistic act might be, they call them like the special Santas or secret Santas, where a person will go to like Walmart and they'll pay off somebody's layaway. they'll without telling anybody who they are, without asking anybody to acknowledge them, without posting it on Facebook. This is something that somebody does sort of anonymously. Also things like paying for somebody's meal behind you at the drive-through. That person doesn't know until you've driven off, and you're not sitting there waiting for them to thank you. Volunteering your time is a pro-social behavior. Volunteering your energy, not necessarily just giving money or paying for something, but also doing something nice for somebody is considered a pro-social behavior. So one thing that is sort of the opposite of doing the right thing happens to be the bystander effect. And this is not necessarily a malicious thing, but this is just something that is an accidental bad thing. So when we consider an accident, let's say you're driving down the street and you see a car slam into another car, and they obviously need help. If there are other people around you, if there are like 5 other cars and you see that other people have seen it, you're going to be a lot less likely to call 911. That's because this is what we refer to as the bystander effect. There's a lot of other bystanders, and so you assume that somebody else is calling, and somebody else is assuming you're calling, and what ends up happening is that nobody calls. And so essentially nobody is taking responsibility. So there's a diffusion of responsibility. Nobody takes the responsibility to get help. And so the idea is that, that nobody gets help. There's also, this idea that normative social influence and informative or informational social influence come into play. Normative social influence is acting in a socially, acceptable way. Should I call the cops? Is anybody else calling the cops? I heard a scream. Should I, is that the right thing to do? Informational social influence would be, I heard a scream, but was somebody just playing outside, or was it just kids that are, running around? Is somebody really needing help? And it turns out that people who are in big cities, who grow up in big cities and live in big cities, are a lot less likely to get help than somebody's from a rural environment. And one theory is that people that are in big cities are exposed to a lot of different sights and sounds and stimuli. And so what it is that you tend to ignore things around you. So you might not even notice if somebody needs help. Also, if the situation is vague or ambiguous, you're not sure what's going on. You don't even know if somebody needs help. Let's say you see 2 cars stopped on the side of the road. They were out and they seem to be like just talking, but you're not sure, did they get in an accident? Do they need help? If it's really vague or ambiguous, you're going to be a lot less likely to call for help because you're like, well, I don't want to cause a problem. If the personal costs outweigh the benefits. So for example, if you're going to be in danger if you help, that will actually stop you from helping. So if it's a burning building and you don't want to die in the burning building, you're not going to go in and rescue someone. If you don't know how to do something, so let's say there's somebody that passed out and they stopped breathing, but you don't know CPR, you want to help, but you don't know how to help, that will stop you from helping. Really, when it comes down to it, in order to avoid being a victim of the bystander effect, the idea is to just call for help. Just even if you're not sure, just call 911, because it could be that you're the only person doing it. You see this a lot less in rural situations because sometimes you might be the only person who saw it. In that case, it's not the bystander effect. You'll call because nobody else is there. But just confirming that somebody is calling. The work on the bystander effect actually came about because of a case that happened, and there's a YouTube video that explains it really well and talks about Darlene Latané's work. So Darlene Latané saw this case in the newspaper where a young woman, Kitty Genovese, was walking down in a big city. She was walking home from work, I believe, and a man came out and started stabbing her. And so she screamed for help. And there were a lot of people in their homes all around where she was. I believe the number varies between like 20 and 30 people who had heard what happened. And nobody called the cops. And so somebody was stabbing her, and somebody opened their window and yelled out like, "What's going on?" And then the guy ran off, and so she's like bleeding to death on the steps of, I believe, a building. And somebody kind of poked their head in and was like, "What's going on?" And then closed their door. And then the person came back when nobody called the police. So the person came back, actually finished her off and killed her. Um, and she was there, and then the ambulance came later after they realized something happened, and somebody finally dialed 911. But she would have been saved if it weren't for the bystander effect. If somebody had said, "I'm calling the police," and actually called the police, she might have been saved. But she ended up dying on the street because nobody called for help. And so this is something that can be a major issue. um, and really the whole thing stems behind a diffusion of responsibility. That's like, everyone thinks that somebody else is helping, and nobody's actually helping. So watch the video. It's really interesting to see this particular instance. It's a sad story, but the good thing is, out of all this unfortunate thing that happened to Kitty Genovese, is that the Darley and Latine's work came about, and we figured out exactly what causes the bystander effect, and what factors are in place that can lead to someone helping versus not helping. So even though it was a pretty terrible situation, it was a really great it's really great research has come from it, from a very unfortunate event. So take a look at that video. It's really interesting. Use the slide to help you go through and study all the different terms. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Please send me an email, and I'll be happy to answer them. So have a great rest of your weekend, and good luck on your studying.